Well, welcome all to PZI Zen Luminaries Series. We have with us tonight, we're very honored and very pleased to have Ocean Vuong, who is both a poet and a novelist, and we'll talk about his works later. So thank you so much, Ocean, for joining us. It's late, I know, back on the East Coast, and it's just lovely to have you here. The New Yorker called The Night Sky with Exit Wounds. That was his first collection of poetry in 2016, a soaring, sober consideration of his family's absorption into the American fold. And then his novel came out several years later, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And the New Yorker called it a beautifully meditative novel borrowed from his life growing up queer and surrounded by despair and addiction in post-industrial New England. And then Time as a Mother came out last year. That's a collection of poetry again, full of concentrated kaleidoscopic riffs on the feelings and sounds, the delirious highs and darkest lows that make up contemporary life. So welcome, Ocean, and welcome everybody to our discussion with him. Ocean, I thought if you can, we'd read On Earth is Briefly Gorgeous from Night Sky with Exit Wounds. Would that be possible?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, John, and thank you everyone for having me in this series. Always a pleasure to talk to everyone, particularly under the foundation of Buddhism, which to me touches pretty much everything I do, and I'm sure everyone here can attest to the same. I'll read a couple poems. I'll read this long piece, and then we'll wrap up with a poem at the end of it. And in the meantime, we'll dive into a lovely conversation. So thank you, everyone. This poem is in sections, so I'll take a little pause in between. On Earth, we're briefly gorgeous. 1. Tell me it was for the hunger and nothing less. For hunger is to give the body what it knows it cannot keep. That this amber light, whittled down by another war, is all that pins my hand to your chest. 1. You drowning between my arms, stay. You pushing your body into the river, only to be left with yourself. Stay. 1. I'll tell you how we're wrong enough to be forgiven. How one night after backhanding mother, then taking a chainsaw to the kitchen table, my father went to kneel in the bathroom until we heard his muffled cries through the walls. And so I learned that a man in climax was the closest thing to surrender. 1. Say surrender. Say alabaster, switchblade, honeysuckle, goldenrod. Say autumn despite the green in your eyes. Beauty despite daylight. Say you'd kill for it. Unbreakable dawn mounting in your throat. My thrashing beneath you like a sparrow stunned with falling. 1. Dusk, a blade of honey between our shadows, draining. 1. I wanted to disappear, so I opened the door to a stranger's car. He was divorced. He was sobbing into his hands that tasted like rust. The pink breast cancer ribbon on his keychain swayed in the ignition. Don't we touch each other just to prove we are still here? I was still here once. The moon, distant and flickering, trapped itself in beads of sweat on my neck. I let the fog spill through the cracked window and cover my fangs. When I left The Buick kept sitting there, a dumb bull in pasture, its eyes searing my shadow onto the side of suburban houses. At home, I threw myself on the bed like a torch and watched the flames gnaw through my mother's house until the sky appeared, bloodshot and massive. How I wanted to be that sky, to hold every flight and fall at once. 1. Say amen. Say amend. Say yes. Say yes anyway. 1. In the shower, sweating under cold water, I scrubbed and scrubbed. 1. It's not too late. Our heads haloed with gnats and summer too early to leave any marks. Your hand under my shirt as static intensifies on the radio. Your other hand pointing your daddy's revolver to the sky, stars dropping one by one in the crosshairs. This means I won't be afraid if we're already here, already more than skin can hold, that a boy sleeping beside a boy must make a field full of ticking, that to say your name is to hear the sound of clocks being turned back another hour, and morning finds our clothes on your mother's front porch, shed like weak old lilies.
Stay, yeah. I was, when I read your collection of poetry, first collection of poetry, and then also On Earth Were Briefly Gorgeous, which was a novel. I was just so drawn to your passion, but also this violence, and this anger and this redemption, and it's just all mixed together. How do we look at this poem?
Yeah, I was deeply inspired by, other Buddhist American writers, Snyder, of course, but particularly Ginsberg. And I think within queer aesthetics, there's kind of, and I'm being very overly simplistic here, but in the 20th century literary queer aesthetics, you kind of have a demarcation or a branching between, say, an Andre Gide, and from there Ginsberg to Dennis Cooper, and then a Proust, right? And Edmund White, where one is a little more delicate, right? There's the queers that go to the opera, and then there's queers that go to the park. And I've always, as in literature, I've always been attracted to, the latter. I would add to that David Wojnarowicz, coming from the New York scene with Peter Hujar, and that sort of marginalized, esoteric avant-garde. And so I think for me, having a serialized poem that does not move beyond one was really important to kind of resist the linear movement of that tradition. Right? The serial poem is very useful because it produces a sort of ecosystem that lives sequentially. And I kind of wanted to lean into that while denying it at the same time. And now that I'm thinking on it, I say, well, that's actually quite Buddhist, right? I mean, there's this idea of reincarnation and the repetition, and that time might be quite quantum rather than linear and particulate, the way it's often spoken about. And the poem is a great place to do that because it doesn't have to adhere to the physics, right? When I teach fiction, I say, so much of fiction is dependent on physics. She walked into the room, she opened the door. Bodies needed to be accounted for in the plot system of the novel, whereas in the poem, everything is floating, everything is unhinged. And I must admit, I have much more pleasure personally writing poems. I think for that very reason, is that it's more like walking on the moon, whereas the novel is a very terrestrial, earthly endeavor.
Uh-huh. Well, there's an argument to be made that your novel is very poetic. It's almost like the Japanese haibun, right? Where the poetry bleeds into the prose and the prose bleeds into the poetry. But uh, towards the end of your novel, you said at this time, and you're writing to your mother, you said, "I told myself we were born from war." So Trevor's guns and Trevor's violence, and then also the violence that you received in your what they call ijime, or your bullying in school, which was pretty extreme. And you said, "We were born from beauty. Let no one mistake us for the fruit of violence, but that violence, having passed through fruit, failed to spoil it." And so even though there's a lot of this very dark material in your work, I feel like there's this upwelling of this light, or this redemptive quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can go right into Buddhism and teach. I was a Buddhist, I was a practitioner long before I became an artist. And that might have been the great luck of my career, because I didn't know it. I became a Buddhist because I was dying. I was literally dying internally, spiritually. My friends were dying from the opioid epidemic. And I was culturally Buddhist in that, every Sunday we give fruit to the statue for decade.
Mm.
I just did it because my mother told me to. But most of my family were illiterate. And when I asked, they couldn't really give me any good reason why. In fact, their reasons was as dogmatic as Christianity that I encountered, which is that, well, that's the way it is. You give the Buddha fruit because, it will, the fruit will come back to us, and that's we and that's as if I'm lucky. That's as much as an explanation as I ever got. Mostly it's just do it, don't ask any questions. But what I saw was that it was absolutely revered. The altar was revered, and to see your parents, who are so powerful in a small child's life, bow down, and I wonder, what that would do. I've been a teacher now for 10 years, and mostly with graduate students, but I wonder what that would do to American students, to American youth, to see their parents bow more,
Mm.
to realize that they are not always in contention. They don't always have to topple their parents, because their parents, there's something larger than their parents, and that the world is much larger. And I think I was actually very compassionate to my mother, seeing her every morning wake up at 5 in the morning, pull me up out of bed, cold. I mean, Hartford in winter, brutal, in these tenement apartments, because the heat is determined by the landlord. Sometimes he turns it on at 8, sometimes he turns it on at noon. So we would pad over to the altar, and to see your mother, you can argue with her, you can have a fight with her, you say it's not fair, whatever, yesterday, last night, but then to see her bow, kneel down, and press her head to the hardwood, something changes in you as a child. And when I was suffering in dukkha or samsara, when I was aware of samsara, around 18, I went to the library, and I went to the religion section, and I said, I want to know what this force is that had my elders bow every day. What is the gravity of this force? I need to know it, see if I can use it. And if I can't use it, then I'll never look at it again. And so began my journey into Zen practice, because that was what was mostly available in the public library in Hartford and in the surrounding areas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Before we get back into your Zen practice, for those who are not as familiar with your background, can you just tell us a little bit about your mother, about your grandmother, about your grandfather, and and how you came to the States?
Yeah, I'm a product of violence. I'm a product of war. It's kind of like the quote that you said there. That quote is kind of like a koan, you know, that I would not be alive without the Vietnam War. My grandfather was a GI. My grandmother was a rice farmer, and she ran away from a forced marriage, and that was taboo in her village, and so she couldn't stay. So she went to the city. And
That was the
things,
Mekong Delta there, I guess, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
And then she dated and met my grandfather, and they got married. Um, and it was really uh, jarring. It's very rare for a GI to marry. But my grandfather was 22. He didn't think the war was going to end. He thought it was going to go on forever. It was going on forever at that time. This is about 69, and right after the Tet Offensive and everything. But anyway, he went back. His mother was ill. He went back in 70, 71 to see her, and then every everything changed. Everything started to collapse, and they separated. I mean, it's kind of like this. It's like a bad movie. It's almost like too dramatic to be real. If I were writing fiction, I would try to take something. I would kind of tamp it down. But that's kind of what happened. We lost touch of him until 1990, when we arrived in the States via refugee camp in the Philippines, and then we landed in Hartford, and I became a child of Hartford. Little did I know it was a perfect place to be, to understand America. New England itself. I see myself really regionally as a New England writer.
How do you mean it was a perfect place to come to understand America?
you know, you could be in Hartford and you can listen to reggaeton and listen to, the conversations of Puerto Rican immigrants and Haitian immigrants.
Hmm.
And then you ride your bike across a bridge and you're in the suburbs, you're in tobacco fields. And New England is so cramped. It's also very old in America's history. And so you can move through incredible swaths of wealth and poverty on your bicycle, which is how I grew up. And I didn't realize this until I started to travel, in the Midwest or Texas in the South, where everything was like in a matter of 4 or 5 hours in a car.
Hmm.
Whereas here, you could be in a completely different world, and that world is actually mimetic of America at large.
But you lived in, as you mentioned, public housing and pretty simple circumstances with your grandmother, your mother, and your mother worked in a nail salon for many years, um, and your aunt did as well.
Pretty much everybody did. My uncle
Everybody.
worked in a Colt factory, a Colt pistol. Samuel
Mhm.
Colt from Hartford, his building, his factory, the original factory from the 1840s is still there, and he made his fortune. He was the first sort of manufacturing tycoon, and he made his fortune selling arms to both sides during the
Right.
Civil War. So talk about violence. I mean, it's ironic that I came from a civil war into a country with its own civil war, which the effects of which we still feel today.
Now, in Night Sky, you mentioned your father quite a bit, but you don't mention him in really. He kind of doesn't go away, but not much mention in On Earth and in Time as a Mother. I guess you didn't grow up with your father. He was out in California.
Yeah, yeah. He had enough space. He had enough space, in the first book. But the first book, he's not really there. I think one of my interests as a poet is to mythologize the power of myth. I mean, we go back to Gilgamesh, the Iliad. Every nation has its own national myth, and the theorist Edward Glissant really provocatively has this wonderful theory that the the national myth is the cause for ultimately war, because it's actually the myth is historically a very conservative genre. Its central role is to justify and legitimize a state, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who are we as Greeks? Well, we are a people that will launch 1,000 ships to preserve a man, Agamemnon's honor, if his wife, his betrothed, is taken by Paris of Troy, right? So then it becomes the national myth that this people are a people that will literally go to war to protect one man's honor. And then on the other side of that, with the Odyssey, we are a people that celebrates a man's journey, a decades-long journey to return to his house, to put his house in order through slewing his wife's suitors, right? So it's very patriarchal, and that's just the world. But I was interested in kind of, that's why the Greek myths are shot through Night Sky. What happens if I were to mythologize the father who's not there? What does that mean? And I think it gave me a sort of mound of earth to kind of rise up at the beginning of my career. And so that I could launch from there into other things that were more interesting to me, which is, what is the mother figure in relation to the mother tongue?
Well, I was so moved. I was very close to my mother and my family, and how you grew up so tightly. It sounded like you were almost sleeping on the floor together in one big bed, and certainly that's very much a Southeast Asian, Philippine, possibly Vietnamese tradition. And you were so close, and sometimes the violence in your hometown there was such that your grandmother was almost having PTSD, and you were all huddled down and quiet and turn out the lights as if you were in combat, but you were also very, very close and tender. You would give your mother these massages, scrape with a quarter, and talk to us about your mother and your relationship with your mother and grandmother.
Well, they were, I was raised by women, and I never felt that I came from a broken household. I've always felt that as long as there was enough love, the house is full. And I never missed a father figure. There's a lot of hullabaloo about that in the American conversation. And, there's a lot of truth to that, I think. But in my case, I felt completely full. I was with, 3 aunts and my grandmother and my mother. So we were never at a loss, even though we were so poor. But the novel, I must say, the novel is not entirely, it's not memoir. It would not hold up to fact checking. I think it was purposeful. My agent told me, you can write a memoir, but I didn't want to, because I felt like it was not my place to elucidate the lives of these women without their permission. I didn't want to speak for them. It was very important for me to not speak for them, but I wanted to treat them the way, Tolstoy treated the Russian people, the Russian serfs, from the serfs to the aristocrats, which is to say, I wanted to be inspired by them, but I did not want to render them. So there are many versions. So I told myself, if I finish this book and these characters are recognizable as my family, I would never publish it. So that was my task, and I wanted to.
I see.
My task for myself was transformation, which again is another Buddhist foundation. And so I thought, okay, what if instead of remaking my life and their life in a book, I create a parallel universe? This is a parallel universe. And quite frankly, the main character is much more braver, much more considerate, much more patient than I am. And his mother is much more interesting than my mother. So there goes the artifice of fiction. My mother doesn't chain smoke, but I needed this mother to chain smoke. There's something so powerful about, she needed something to track through. she needed to have that sort of barbedness. My mother was very fretful and fragile and tender, but I needed this mother to be much more tougher. And so the dramatization, and that's why I never pretend that this is my life. I always say, this is a parallel universe. I wanted to launch these characters under conditions in which I never saw in my life. You know, a simulation, if you will. This is a simulation, you know, that requires much more courage. And I think in the grand scheme of things, that is what fiction is. It's the great simulation.
Well, the thing that we can be certain of is it's Ocean Vuong, right? So, yeah, 100%. So storytelling is something you bring up in the book, and in the book, your fictional or actual grandmother Lan, she says that the snow in my hair makes my head itch. She says, "Will you pluck out my itchy hairs, little dog?" You in the book, your name was Little Dog. Was that your nickname in actual life, or no?
I was called, I mean, every run was called Little Dog at one point, you know,
Okay.
but it was wonderful to kind of turn it into a metaphor for the book. Yeah.
Okay. And then she says, make grandma young today, okay? And then she said real quiet, grinning, and then you say in the novel, for this I was paid in stories. And you've talked a lot about the stories that your women in many interviews, the women that raised you and the stories that they had. You know, stories are important for us in the Buddhist context, but tell us about your stories and your storytelling.
Well, it was very practical, you know. When we arrived, we had just, you know, nothing. We had a coupon for a stack of coupons for KFC and donations from the Salvation Army who sponsored us. And so there was no TV, no radio, and we lived just like my family lived in the refugee camp, except now it's in an apartment in Hartford, Connecticut. And the way we entertained each other was to tell stories, particularly ghost stories. I was absolutely enamored of ghost stories. I was raptured, and I think that was what planted the seed. But also, I saw these women use what I call auto-fiction, auto-mythology, where they come to a country in which they're absolutely powerless, no language, no money. They are refugees of war. They have no work. And so very quickly, if that is your plight, but also you are the leader of the household, you can lose respect raising all boys. I mean, it's very Shakespearean. I can't make it up. We have a whole family of daughters who gave birth to all boys. There are 7 boys in my cousins, in my generation. And so it's a very strange power dynamic. And what I saw quite brilliantly was these women position themselves into their own stories. Every time they tell a story, it's different. And every time they tell a story, they get more and more powerful, right, in these tales. And I realized what was happening was that they were using their only source of power left in America, their mouth and their imagination, to get their sons to respect them and to bestow on themselves, to decorate themselves with a dignity so that they can control the household and run a house full of refugees. And it was such an incredible thing. And I actually, when I studied Moby Dick and Melville and Whitman, I realized, wait a minute, Whitman and Melville were doing the same thing, right? Whitman confabulated himself, overly bombastic, right? Very well then, you know, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I'm vast, I contain multitudes. And similarly to Melville's, Moby Dick was so radical, even to this day, because it dared to use a memoiristic, autobiographical lens on the American working class, right? It's a book about a multi-ethnic group of whalers who were in limbo. They were not terrestrial. They were in the middle of the sea. And this was at a time where, like Hawthorne, you know, the British intelligentsia still controlled what was viable for an author. And London still liked books about the social fabric of life. Who gets married to whom? Who divorces whom? And Melville said, I'm going to write a book about an America that doesn't exist, an America in the middle of the sea. And I'm going to talk about how this labor, this force of labor, harnesses the oil to light this new country. And it was very subversive. It was deeply spiritual.
How did what resonated for you in that story? I mean, personally, what entered, you talk about embodiment. What entered your body from that story?
Moby Dick?
Yeah.
Was a fellow New England writer. He wrote it in Pittsfield. I'm in Northampton now, so that's about 45 minutes from here. But what was beautiful about Moby Dick was that he said no to nothing. Melville kind of broke away from the 18th century novelistic tools, character development, crescendo, twist, decrescendo, resolution. At the end, do they get married or not, right? The Jane Austens, the Middlemarches et al., the Brontes, like, so even Dickens, right? All of these great social novels that have this moral sort of finale that settles and offers a new sort of testament to what a quote unquote man should be. We have to remember in the 19th century, the idea of literary criticism was that great men wrote great works. Now, we've since debunked that, but it was tied to that, right? Modernism after World War I broke that thinking. But
so how did that influence your writing and your creativity?
Yeah, I'm getting to it.
Okay.
So this idea that an author can stand up to all that and write towards a loss, right? And it was a loss. Moby Dick sold little more than 1,000 copies. And in a time before Netflix and movie theaters, that's pennies, that's nothing. They misspelled his name, right, in the New York Times in his obituary. Horrible. He ends up writing more lines of poetry than he does Dickinson and Whitman combined. But I was inspired by that because it was so radical. And when it was my turn to write a novel, I wanted to put everything in it, just like Melville did. He had 30 pages on comparing whale drawings. If you give that to an editor today, forget it. You'll never get a shot, right? But what I loved about that was that there was something so resilient in the parenthetical. It broke away from the plot rules, right? He said, if I'm interested in comparing, humpback whale sketches, then I'm going to do that. If I'm interested in having a theological treatise in the middle of this ship, if I'm going to use Shakespearean monologue, right, for example, I'm going to do that. If I'm going to have a huge sort of exegesis on whiteness as a social political ramification of the whale, so be it. And it felt incredibly American to me. And I do think that it was more Whitmanic in this way than Whitman himself. And so if you have a descendant of this lineage, another New England writer in myself, coming almost 150 years later, and I read this and I said, my goodness, what if I wrote a novel? As a poet, I knew I could do it in a 250 pages rather than 700 pages. I knew I can contract it, I can compress it a bit. And I said, I want to write about everything. The opioid epidemic that started in Stamford, Connecticut with Purdue Pharma. I want to talk about Vietnam, what it means to be American. I want to talk about American masculinity. I want to talk about refugee women, queerness, coming of age in post-industrial New England, post-industrial Hartford, when all the insurance companies were all gone. It was not the Hartford of Mark Twain or Harriet Beecher Stowe or Wallace Stevens. It was the Hartford of that I saw was completely blighted and destroyed, sucked up. Every good thing was sucked up by Boston and New York. And I said, if Melville could put everything in his book, why can't I? And when I was selling this book, I ran into all these roadblocks from the editors in New York, and they said, there's too many things. There's too many things. And luckily, you have too many things. Take out half of these things and then focus on one. And I was lucky to have read Melville. I was lucky to be a nerd, to be a student of the craft, because I had a rebuttal. And I tell my students now, it's so important to know your field, because someone who doesn't know the field is going to stop you when they're in the powerful position. And if you don't have an answer to that, you're stuck. And this goes with every field you do. And I had an answer, and I said, well, it was already done 150 years ago. And I last I checked, Moby Dick had many more things than this slim little volume.
Did you send him the 700-page novel, the Moby Dick, as
I
proof?
I said, walk over to the Strand. Walk over to the Strand. You know, it's interesting now that you go into the Strand, fiction is under the symbol of the whale, right? So a book that has completely failed has now become a symbol of the genre itself. It's an incredible book. I highly recommend it to anyone.
Going to creativity here, the source of creativity. What is the source of your creativity? You say as a writer, really, you're a conductor of energy. Talk to us about creativity. Where does this create this desire to go there, to break out, to be different? Where does that come from in you?
Oh God. I don't know. I was just never, I was very difficult. Everyone says this, every author says this, so I don't want to sound so cheesy, but it was very difficult for me to conform. I got a lot of trouble when I was in high school. I got arrested. I won't get into any of that, but it was hard for me to understand what conformity led to, which is why I think it was so humbling. And the reasons why I didn't go completely awry was seeing my elders bow. It was so mysterious to me, right? Because they were under so much pressure in this country, and yet they didn't get anything from bowing. It didn't increase their income, and it didn't cut their taxes, and yet they were so obliged to it. And I think that sense of mystery was what kept me in line. But I think if you look into the Buddhist teaching, particularly the Tibetan traditions, where these lamas, the idea of crazy wisdom that was popular with Ginsberg in the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics in Colorado, there was this idea of this radical break, that insanity, quote unquote, was actually a part of experience, that it was not necessarily wrong. And that really spoke to me, that this idea that breaking the rule, but breaking it with meaning, conscientious break, not just to break it, just to be cool, right? And I think I love Pound's idea, break from tradition, but I would add to that, break it with meaning.
Right.
You have to answer the why.
Right. Can I read you just something you wrote? You should scare yourself, but you should not be scared of yourself. How can you be so vulnerable in your work? Does it destroy you? Need to look long and hard at samsara, questing towards phenomena, to get close to the terror, that is to get close to being human. Yeah. This quality that I can see it obviously in your work of going there, and a willingness to go there, and a willingness to scare yourself, but not be scared of yourself, perhaps.
That's what we sign up for when we decide to be writers. My students ask me, many people ask me, how can you be so vulnerable? And I say, it's a privilege to be vulnerable. It's
Mm.
an immense privilege. I live in a country that has historically fought for freedom of speech, that allows me to be a writer and thinker under my own terms. And what a wonderful opportunity I get to be vulnerable and open in my work. You know, writers historically don't always get to do that. Many writers who've said the things that I've said have been dead by now historically. And so I think also that because my family have worked in factories and been working in manual labor, and I worked in manual labor, I worked in tobacco fields, that to me, this is kind of like the after party of life. This is, I never thought I would make a life as a writer. This is all the cherry on top. And I don't want to, come here and then pull myself back. It's our duty as writers to look at humanity, the dark and the light, and actually see that between the two extremes, it makes the chiaroscuro, that makes the tableau so fascinating. It is the pain that makes joy so valuable. I mean, this is the samsara experience, to not judge. Non-duality has been one of the most profound methods. And I do say methods because I think we can talk about form, sentence structures, subordinate clauses, plot devices, metaphors. But before all that gets deployed on the page, I think it's the gaze, a non-dualistic gaze at the world, that provokes me to be very suspicious of what I'm told. And maybe this comes from this sort of dharmic, a dharma-based rebelliousness in me, where I don't believe when things are given to me in a binary. I don't believe when, someone says, or the textbook says, this person is bad, this person is good. I'm interested in my work that there are no villains and there are no victims. There are human beings. It's not black and white. And Buddhism teaches us that that is actually the foundation of experience, to not.
Bringing together your Buddhist Zen Buddhist practice and your poetry writing, I was fascinated to hear how you work on poems that you said you only write 5 or 6 poems a year. However, you'll carry a poem around with you in an embodied experience, and you walk around with the poem. And it sounds very much like a koan, how we work with koans. We embody koans, we eat with koans, we sleep with koans, we sit with koans, we walk with koans. And you say, so I don't write it down, but when I do, it comes all at once. And but I live it 110% for your words. How is that embodied experience of writing for you?
Oh, it was, I wish I could say it was some genius scheme, but it came out of absolute failure. When I decided to be I was in business school, believe it or not. That was where I first started to go to school in New York at Pace University. I dropped out after 3 weeks. And I was so ashamed to go home to Connecticut and tell my mother I failed. She was so proud. My son is going to college. She couldn't even pronounce the school, but she kept the brochure at her desk at the nail salon to show customers. My son is going here. And when I didn't even sign out, I just left the building and never came back. I couldn't fake it. All of my peers had suits on. They were going off to internships at Goldman Sachs and Chase Bank. And I was like, well, who am I kidding? What am I doing? Like every first son in an immigrant family, I thought, let me just make the money, pay back what I owe to these people, and then be an artist. Well, I couldn't do it. I was not a good chameleon. And I walked out super depressed, walked across the Brooklyn Bridge thinking about Hart Crane and Whitman, who wrote beautifully about this bridge. And I said, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to, couch surf with my friends. And I made the best of it. And I went into bars And so my education began in the back of bars. In open mics, you get 3 minutes on stage, you read your poem, and some of my best edits would come while I was reading those poems. And sometimes in the back of these bars, somebody would do a workshop after the open mic. So forget about academia. I learned how to write a sonnet with ABAB rhyme, with the volta, 14 lines, iambic pentameter in the back of bar 13 in Union Square. That's also where I learned how to write a pantoum, right? So this idea of this communal knowledge was so exciting to me. And I said, I got to find a way to legitimize this for my family. So someone said, why don't you go to CUNY? You're already matriculate as a New York resident. It's cheap. Get a degree at CUNY, study English, study poetry, and then show it to your family. And I said, brilliant. My family can't read. I'm going to get a degree in English and tell my mother I'm a businessman. Amazing. So the mythology continues, and so that's what I did. And I just walked into, and little did I know, I was walking into Brooklyn College, where Allen Ginsberg taught, John Ashbery, John Yao. Michael Cunningham was there as a fiction writer who wrote The Hours. And at that time, James Franco was getting an MFA at the same time. But I didn't know what wealth I was walking into. And then I kind of just never looked back from then.
Nice. Touching on your meditation, death meditation, since you were 15, you said that you've been, I guess you're living near a cemetery, I guess, and just curious about the meditation and why a death meditation in the Buddhist practice.
I forget where I stumbled on that. It's interesting, between the library and the Vietnamese temple that I went to in New Britain, you get a lot of interesting texts. A lot of them are just translated by monks and senseis, often from China, from the Chan branch, and they'll come through translations. But somewhere I stumbled upon that, and I was really terrified of it, because death was happening all over. You have to understand, growing up in New England in 2002, 3, and 4, you have Purdue Pharma from Stamford, Connecticut, and they were producing Oxycontin. And the way they sold it, it's very fascinating, the Oxycontin pandemic that we now, are so familiar with. At that time, no one knew what it was. It was so shameful. We had teachers overdosing, accountants, fathers, mothers, brothers. If somebody's brother would break an ankle on their bicycle, 2 years later, they're full-blown heroin addict. And families were so ashamed that they wouldn't even hold wakes or funerals. They would cremate their children. Their children would be dropped off in the back of the home, stone cold by their friends, terrified. And these families would evaporate. They would move away. And this is before iPhones and social media. And so I've had friends who I have no evidence of to this day. There's no telling. It's really fascinating. It doesn't seem that long ago, but we traversed something major in those early aughts with the iPhone. It's the same thing as the generation that got the T-Model Ford, I feel, where we jumped decades within a few years. And when Purdue was selling, the Sackler family, which is also now household name, but when they were selling Oxycontin to doctors, they told their salespeople, when the doctors asked, is this pill abuse resistant? The people on the phone selling it would say, instead of saying yes, which would be a lie, which they could get sued for, they said, uh-huh. Is this pill abuse resistant? Uh-huh, uh-huh. All these calls are recorded and would not stand up in the court of law because uh-huh is not a word. And so to for a poet, you know, to look back, that the word aha was responsible. And I'm convinced it's a word. It should be in the dictionary. It's responsible for thousands of deaths. Started this poison that we felt. It went all the way up I-91 and down, and traveled down to West Virginia, across to Ohio, and now it's all over. Now we have fentanyl. But that was kind of the beginning of my childhood. And so death was everywhere. And I saw this book that says, look closer at it. Look
The
closer.
power, yeah, the power of words, which you've talked about. I wanted to just bring something up, and I think this is factually correct, that because you've talked about it, and it was so touching to me when your mother, who couldn't understand English and grew up in very tough economic straits, and then she saw her son reading poetry to a group of white people who were actually, some of whom perhaps, or their type, were her clients, who she would kneel to every day. Can you tell us about that experience a little bit?
Yeah, it was at the Harry Beecher Stowe House, and you know, I doubt uh, any of them were actually her clients. You know, but maybe she was so amicable that she would have went up and say hello to her clients if they were. But um, it was a tiny reading. It was just and it was mostly white, only because it was the people in the Harry Beecher Stowe Society, older folks, who were working on the home, and mostly volunteers. So I hadn't published anything, and it was the first time that she saw me read, and because it was local. I was reading in the back of bars for years, and I finally had a legitimate reading, you know, with a program. And I invited her, and she was so touched at the end. You know, people stood up in their polite way, and they clap, and she was crying, and I said, "What's going on?" And she said, I never thought I would see a room full of white people clapping for my son. No one has ever clapped for us." And I was a bit arrogant, you know. I kept it to myself, but in my mind, here I am. I'm another generation. I'm coming from New York. I'm educated there, and I said, "That's not winning, Mom." You know, in my heart, I said, I don't know how that's winning. There has to be more than that. What does it mean for Asian Americans to win only when white people clap for us? There has to that's a strange bar. Forget about low or high. It's just an odd bar to have. So it was not my triumph. And then the next day, I followed her to work, and then I saw her bend, that gesture of bowing down, but this time at the foot of a client. And it just hit me. I said, it doesn't matter what I think. This is her triumph. I didn't have to do that day in and day out to raise my children. I never had to bow to anybody in that way in order to clean and make somebody's foot beautiful. And so because when they were clapping for her as well. You produced this child that we value. And I've learned something really important there, that it is immoral to map my own values onto anybody else. You know, most of all my mother. And I realized that was a triumph. And she helped me see that. And again, I was thinking in a dualistic way, that there's this triumph and there's that, and they're so clear cut. But I could not see with compassion until I saw her the next morning.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to turn it over to John Tarrant, director of Pacific Zen here, and see if he has any thoughts or any questions.
Yeah, thanks. It's really moving for me. I'm sort of it's like all the different, that Buddhist image of the net of Indra, all these nets are crossed and the jewel at each intersection they hold all the rest of the pieces of the universe. So each piece. If tonight you're the piece that holds the rest of the universe.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful, so somewhat like for people of my age, like meditation was an answer, not an answer, but a sort of, I don't know, escape hatch or something from the Vietnam War. I knew Thich Nhat Hanh, not well, but well enough to talk to when I wanted things. But and it was a tremendous sorrow and shame at that time, and people I knew were going over to kill people and perfectly innocent in another country and for bad reasons, which is common, but still, and so we did, I went underground. I just didn't want to play, so I spent time in mines and things like that, just out of that. But then and eventually, we in Australia we pulled it out quicker, but than the US. But we sort of pretended we were involved more in superpower. But that so hooked up with meditation and people learning meditation, coming back having learned, and then I ended up learning with Tibetans and Vietnamese people and Japanese people, and then some people, like what we decide, what we're doing, the whole project of Pacific Zen is about, like, can we give people something to both transform and open their hearts in the kind of circumstances pretty much we're always in, so like that, so that your work talks about. And so I guess I just want to say I'm really touched. And
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's really, really beautiful and very brave. Thank you so much.
And so we're trying to hold a place where people can. The whole thing about meditation is not so much, it's nice work when you can get it it helps me and stuff. But it's really to hold for the younger people, for anybody, like there's a path out of the madness if you want it that way. And so that's what. So I can feel you're steeped in that. Nice to see you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, John.
Yeah, Allison, did you have any thoughts or questions? Also, we can take questions via chat from the audience. So if you have a question, just type in a chat and we'll pick it up.
Yeah, I was very interested. First of all, that you love Moby Dick, which is also one of my all-time favorite books. But I was thinking about when you lived in a refugee camp. I don't know how long you were there, but in some way, it's a kind of bardo where your actual life is not yet happening, and in a way, the Moby Dick ship was a bit like a refugee camp and a bardo as well. So I was very interested in hearing what it was like to live in the bardo.
Yeah, that's a brilliant connection, Allison. I've never thought of it that way, but I think you're absolutely onto something there, both with the refugee camp and Moby Dick. It makes me love the book even more because I do think it is this thing, and I think that's what the great unease. I mean, it's still a fascinating book because the narrator starts off by saying, when I get depressed, I go to sea, right? And so there's a kind of fatigue of life. There's a kind of death that happens. He says, when I get melancholic, they say it in the 19th century term, Victorian term. When I'm so consumed with melancholy, I go to to Nantucket and become a whaler, which is crazy as a plot device. But it makes absolute sense that the death of a spirit will lead someone to be in limbo and travel through the bardo. I was only in the camp for 1 year as a 1-year-old. So I have no memory of it. My first memory is of America, and it is eating sour cherry belts at the side of the road in Hartford. And I sound like I'm 70 saying this. I think if anyone's 70 can correct me, but I remember going, because they don't exist like this anymore. Like I said, for some reason, from the 90s to the 2000s, it feels like we've cycled through multiple decades. But I remember going up to this candy shop, and there's these glass jars. And again, I've met people in their 70s who tell me the same thing, but the kids now don't have this experience. I'm 34. And we would go up these glass jars, and there's a paper bag, and there's a man putting red belt in the paper bag. And you get, it's like 50 cents, and he weighs it, and you go out and you eat it in the sidewalk right away. That's my first memory ever. And I don't know what it means, but there you have it. It's not the refugee camp, but it was in a kind of bardo. Living, I didn't know it then, but and I guess many people who senseis who talk to us about the bardo say that many people in the bardo don't know it's a bardo either. And I was in this 1-bedroom apartment, and there was just a huge pile of blankets. That was it. Can you imagine an unfurnished apartment? There's 7 people, and there's just a mound of blankets and clothes just dumped there by the Salvation Army. And the man says, "I'll be back with more things." He never came back. But we had a pile, and so we kind of just turned that into a life. Again, as a kid, it was actually quite fun. It was quite beautiful. It was like playtime, with your family. I didn't think anything of it, but in retrospect, I realized how much of a bardo that is. And again, many people in the bardo don't know it's a bardo either. Thank you for that. That's a great observation. Yeah. But if anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to dive in.
Yeah, we have a few chat questions. Can you, there's from Evan, he asks, yeah, can you tell us the story of your first publication? How did you navigate the process of releasing your work to the world? Evan himself is a budding writer.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you, Evan, for that question. I'm always happy to demystify the process because it's so mystical. But I must say that every writer's journey is mystical. The reason why no one ever gets a clear answer, because it's not clear, and it's different for every writer. And so it's strange, because if you go to nursing school, there's steps to become a nurse. You go out, you train, you put in your hours. Same with lawyer, doctor, physician, what have you. There's a clear sort of path. Now, not to say it's easy, but there's a sort of way. But to be an artist, there is no way. You steal time to make your work. And I wrote most of my poems while working in 2 cafes in New York, and then going to school at Brooklyn College, which is why I now have a habit of working past midnight. I don't start none of my books were written before midnight. It's just the way it is. I don't know how long I can keep this up, but it was a habit I had because I had to have 2 jobs. So it's the only vocation in the sort of one of the only vocation in the college academic role that there is you have to kind of, no one asks how you made it, but when you bring it to market, they'll take it. The New Yorker will take a poem, but they don't give you a way to make the poem. It's almost like this don't ask, don't tell black market in a way, right? And many of us have to apply to fellowships, which is a lottery, just to go off in the woods in Vermont in a cabin for 4 weeks to scribble away. And then it's like, well, you got 4 weeks, now make your masterpiece, right? And after that, it's back to raising children and grinding the job. So we steal time to make work. And that's very, very difficult. And the rest of the world will conspire against you being a writer, maybe even your family. And they do it with all the kindness in their hearts, right? To convince you to do something useful. I guess I was lucky in that I didn't have that pressure because my family didn't know what it was. My mother was just proud that I graduated. I got a cap and gown. You know, like I said, I could have told her it was anything. My degree was anything and she would have been happy. So I was actually very free. So I worked in a cafe and I didn't expect much, you know. I was reading biographies of other writers, Rimbaud, Lorca, and they all died in poverty. And I said, look, I gave the respectable career a shot. I couldn't do it. I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to tough it out. If not, I'll work in the nail salon with my mother and I'll scribble away on the side. That sounds like a decent life. I didn't expect much of myself. And so I worked away and I sent poems out, you know. When I was coming up in 2008 and 9, it seems strange now, but that was at the time where editors, the literary world was still discussing how viable online publication was. And the New Yorker was even having a very, you know, stark debate about is publishing poems online legitimately publishing? Now we don't even think of it, but that was a serious conversation at that time, and there were both sides to that argument. But I was lucky that there was that culture because I would submit to journals and get my way. And anyways, I worked on my first book for 8 years, and I submitted to Copper Canyon, which has a history of publishing, you know, these radical hippie writers from the 60s and 70s, dissenters of the Vietnam War, like W.S. Merwin. You know, after publishing The Lice, would move a lot of his work to Copper Canyon. Red Pine translated a lot of work. So it was the only place I sent to, and it took a year for them to get back. I thought they lost it, and when they called me, I was on my way to my master's program the first day, and I thought it was a spam because my mother puts my number for all of her credit cards. So I thought Seattle. I said, God, it's another. I usually don't pick it up, but I said Seattle. I never got a spam call from Seattle yet, so let's at least entertain it. And I was on the Uptown train, the Q train, heading into Manhattan from Queens, and I heard the editor of Copper Canyon's thing. We'd like to publish your book. And I was about to go under to one more stop, and it's going to go underground. So I got off. I'm at, you know, Queensboro Plaza, and I'm just weeping. I'm sobbing because I was so relieved that I could finally show my mother that I didn't waste my life, that all this amounted to a material thing. And it was a quintessential, I'll never forget, it was a quintessential New York moment. I was collapsed and sobbing under this movie poster called The Expendables. You know, it was Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's a shoot-up movie. And I'm just sobbing. And the New Yorkers, you know, these people coming and say, are you all right? And I'm looking up to them crying. And I said, it's perfect. Everything's perfect. And they're like, oh boy, he's one of those crazy ones, you know. But it took 8 years to write this book, you know. It's 35 poems. And I've written all but 48. So it was pretty much everything that I've ever written. And there's a author photo of me in a tank top. And I was so shy about all this. I didn't want an author photo. But I called my mother about the book, and she said, please get an author photo so I can show my clients that my son is an author, to show your face to them. And again, it was just, I didn't think about these things, and I was so touched that I just, it was like a hot day in my overheated apartment, no AC in Queens, and my friend put a black bed sheet behind me and snapped it just for my mom, and that was it. That's why it looks like I'm in the gym or something, But I didn't expect another book. I thought, let me just get it out of the way, and my dream was just to be an author once. That's it. And so I'm fortunate that I got to do it 2 more times since.
That's great. So Susan writes, Ocean, I heard you read The Summer, and I've been thinking for weeks about your radical vision of language that seems non-dual and all-inclusive, including Basho, Melville, Baldwin, and Dickinson. Do you connect this to your understanding of non-separation? It seems to be a vision of deep humility.
Well, I think the natural, being a writer, I hope, well, there is kind of 2 sides to that coin. I think on one hand, being a writer is an incredibly humbling experience. It's self-humbling because you're working with a material that is both minuscule, myriad, and fragile. It's almost like working with sand. And one false comma and the whole sentence collapses. And that's just the grammar. There's also the energy, there's the emotion that the sentence conducts. I do think the sentence is a conductor of energy. We can read a Tang Dynasty poem, we can read an Aesop haiku, and that feeling from 1730 fires right back through the conductor of the word, and that energy is still felt. Energy doesn't die, it transforms, and literature is one way of hardening and putting in place that conductor so that other people can participate in it. And it's an incredibly humbling experience, draft after draft, starting with absolute unhappiness, right? You're never happy with the first draft. And so you start your project with a sort of perennial failure, a chronic failure, and then you keep working on it until it gets to something that could be shareable and has something valuable to conduct between people. On the other hand, there's something incredibly damaging to the ego to have a book with one's name, and then to have magazines, to have events, to be called a MacArthur genius, right? And what does that do to the ego? And I think Buddhism has been really helpful for me to disassociate my work from myself. I do that meditation too. There's a kind of death meditation I do with my books, where I see it not so much as my identity. The book is not me. I am not my book. It's things I have done, but it is almost futile to be proud of them. I know that sounds very strange, but I hope as Buddhists, y'all can sort of sympathize with what I'm talking about, and perhaps you're the only audience that will understand what I'm talking about. But I have to kind of remove myself. I have to kill this self after I see it in the book. I can't believe in that hype. And I see it, the metaphor I would use is that making a book is like building a raft. You're on the shore, you put the raft together, and when it's done, you send that raft downriver, but you cannot stay on that raft. Mm-hmm. There's nothing you can do on that raft without destroying it. You can't make anything new on that raft without dismantling what you've made. You have to stay on shore. So with these 3 books, they're all the way downriver, and people can do with them as they wish. They can participate in them. They can throw stones at them. But it's no longer me. I am what I am attending to now. That part of me has all been passed on or dead, if you will. And that has been really helpful, because one of the most powerful parts of the Buddhist tenets is the 8 winds. The tree that can stand under the 4 winds of praise and the 4 winds of ridicule is the one that doesn't get toppled over. And that has been really helpful for me in combating or negotiating the egomania that can come. And you study authors and you see them very tragically. Truman Capote is a great example, a great hero of mine. But after in Cold Blood, he couldn't write anymore. He completely, and many people think he died of suicide. It's blurry, but his life was completely derailed after that, because it was too much. He started to conflate the name on the book with the person, and that's a lot to carry, and it's not real. It's a projection. It's an illusion.
Ben says David Hinton in his book Hunger Mountain has a beautiful chapter on the act of bowing. I wonder if you would say a few more words about how the act of bowing affects you. I'm kind of suggesting that in your last comments, right? Making you perhaps more humble or...
Well, I realize that, there was a time where I write by hand. My whole life I've written by hand. All my books are written by hand. And I realized that this posture here was the exact posture that my entire family commits to when they work on people's nails at the manicure desk. Instead of a pen, it's a drill. It's a manicure drill. And that too is a kind of bowing. Reading is a kind of bowing. If you go to the New York subway, you see right. Well, nowadays people bow to their phones. Maybe they're reading, most likely not. But this idea of lowering the head, and I mix in the Tibetan traditions as well. I'm kind of a hybrid. I'm a mutt of all this, and the Tibetan tradition of bowing is fully, it's a prostration of the entire body. And many people in Tibet, of course, you've seen the pilgrimages where they would bow instead of walk many, many miles. And that idea of flattening, I mean, I'm sure someone much smarter than me could talk about how like the ions and the electric charges in the earth are doing something as well to your body. But there is something absolutely humiliating and humbling in the humility that's induced in flattening yourself. And I think it's part of how we evolved. Hierarchical heightening. I mean, our brains, some anthropologists credit our brains from our standing up, right? When we stood up, we saw more and we can start to strategize hunting and gathering. We start to see the way generals see a field, and that supposedly led to our brain growth. But what happens if maybe our brains are too large and the ego comes along with it, and maybe the flattening, the coming back, the doing the downward dog, right, going back to where most animals are, reminds us that we too are an animal. And I wonder if our intelligence too is a weakness. We are a very fragile, physically weak species. We're soft. A bear could probably take 5 of us out in one swipe. But perhaps our intelligence, as evidenced by what we've done to the earth, is also our weakness. We are too smart for our own good, and we've created incredible things that is destroying and killing us. And so, what a better time to practice prostration than now.
Nice. Well, maybe we should, do we have time to end with a poem?
Sure, yeah.
Not even this. It's a little bit of a longer poem, but it's just lovely, lovely poem.
Sure.
And by the way, let me just say that I first read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by listening to your read. And I felt like I got so much more out of it by listening to the audiobook first and then reading, of course, the hardback after that, or the softback after that. But I just love your reading of your poems. I've listened to many of them online and then of your book. So please, not even this.
Hey, I used to be a fag. Now I'm a checkbox. The pen tip jabbed in my back. I feel the mark of progress. I will not dance alone in the municipal graveyard at midnight, blasting sad songs on my phone for nothing. I promise you, I was here. I felt things that made death so large it was indistinguishable from air, and I went on destroying inside it like wind in a storm. The way Lil Peep says, I'll be back in the morning when you know how it ends. The way I kept dancing when the song was over because it freed me. The way the street light blinks twice before waking up for its night shift, like we do. The way we look up and whisper, sorry, to each other, the boy and I, when there's teeth. When there's always teeth on purpose. When I threw myself into gravity and made it work. Ha. I made it out by the skin of my griefs. I used to be a fag, now I'm lit. Ha. Once, at a party set on a rooftop in Brooklyn for an artsy vibe, a young woman said, sipping her drink, you're so lucky, you're gay, plus you get to write about war and stuff. I'm just white. Pause. I got nothing. Laughter, glasses clinking. Because everyone knows yellow pain pressed into American letters turns to gold. Our sorrow Midas touched, napalm with a rainbow afterglow. Unlike feelings, blood gets realer when you feel it. I'm trying to be real, but it costs too much. They say the earth spins and that's why we fall, but everyone knows it's the music. It's been proven difficult to dance to machine gun fire. Still, my people made a rhythm this way. Away, my people so still in the photographs as corpses. My failure was that I got used to it. I looked at us mangled under the time photographer's shadow and stopped thinking, get up, get up. I saw the graveyard steam in the pinkish dawn and knew the dead were still breathing. Ha. If they come for me, take me out. What if it wasn't the crash that made us, but the debris? What if it was meant this way? The mother, the lexicon, the line of cocaine on the Mohawk boy's collarbone in an East Village sublet in 2007. What's wrong with me, Doc? There must be a pill for this. Because the fairy tales were right. You'll need sorcery to make it out of you. Long ago, in another life, on an Amtrak through Iowa, I saw for a few blurred seconds a man standing in the middle of a field of winter grass, hands at his sides, back to me, all of him stopped there, save for his hair scraped by low wind. When the countryside resumed its wash of gray wheat, tractors, gutted barns, black sycamores, and herdless pastures, I started to cry. I put my copy of Didion's The White Album down and folded a new dark around my head. The woman beside me stroked my back, saying in a Midwestern accent that wobbled with tenderness, go on, son, you get that out now, no shame in breaking open. You get that out and I'll fetch us some tea, which made me lose it even more. She came back with Lipton in paper cups, her eyes nowhere blue and there. She was silent all the way to Missoula, where she got off and said, patting my knee, God is good. God is good. I can say it was gorgeous now, my harm, because it belonged to no one else. To be a dam for damage. My shittiness will not enter the world, I thought, and quickly became my own hero. Do you know how many hours I've wasted watching straight boys play video games? Enough. Time is a mother. Lest we forget, a morgue is also a community center. In my language, the one I recall now only by closing my eyes, the word for love is you, and the word for weakness is you. How you say what you mean changes what you say. Some call this prayer. I call it watch your mouth. Rose, I whispered as they zipped my mother in her body bag. Get out of there. Your plants are dying. Enough is enough. Time is a motherfucker, I said to the gravestones. Alive, absurd. Oh body, doorway that you are, be more than what I'll pass through. Stillness, that's what it was. The man in the field in the red sweater, he was so still, he became somehow more true, like a knife wound in a landscape painting. Like him, I caved. I caved and decided it will be joy from now on. Then everything opened. The lights blazed around me into a white weather, and I was lifted, wet and bloody, out of my mother, into the world, screaming, and enough. Thank you.
Thank you for that scream. John Tarrant has a final question, I believe.
I think it's a bit late. I was just thinking of a Maloche line about language is the only homeland. And he was a great wanderer and speaker of many languages and things, and marvelous poet. And so I was thinking about what you think about that, because you've so much taken residence in English or American, and I'm not sure what I think about Maloche's thing, but I wonder, it's something I wonder about it over the years. And what do you think about language as itself a kind of homeland?
Oh, yeah, I love that. I love that idea. I would even add to that I think the only nation is the imagination. And it was interesting. I think, Allison, you might have prompted this in me, but I'm reading this poem now, and I never realized that it's a bardo. The poem ends with birth, but it narrates the lived life as a bardo. And I think for me, maybe one of my own interpretation of literature's role is that it is a kind of virtual reality, and that it is a bardo, but it's in this life. It's fantastical in that way, but it's contrived. It's made possible by artifice. And you can't live in literature. You live in this world, but you embody it psychically. And I think in that sense, language is a homeland, in that it might embrace you more fully than any land or any terrestrial phenomena can. And maybe it sounds unsettling to say or to hear to some, but sometimes I feel more alive reading than I do in this body. That the engagement of a text and that energy can sometimes be more palpable. The smoke I smell embedded in a description of smoke in a text is somehow more real than the smoke I smell in this world. I don't know why that is, but I think the idea that that literature acts as a kind of portal has been a balm to me, and one that I'm incredibly grateful to participate in with others. Yeah, thank you for that.
That's wonderful, Ocean. Thank you so much. Really love having you here and really appreciate your work. It's just so full of life, and it makes me feel alive when I read it. So I really, you talk about this transfer of energy. I feel like you're energizing us, all of us, with life, and that's a wonderful thing. So thank you so much for coming and sharing a few minutes with us. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having my company and for holding the space. And thank you for being. So I'll hope I'll see y'all sometime along the roads and the ways in the great endless possibilities of our samsara.
Yeah. Awesome. Great.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much. Bye-bye. Good night, all.